Good afternoon, boa tarde, bem-vindos e bem-vindas. Welcome to the second event of Amazonian Futures, Futuros Amazônicos, a series of conversations the Brazil Lab is organizing together with the research initiative Amazônia 2030, led by Beto Verissimo and Juliana Assunção, and the High Meadows Environmental Institute. My name is João Bill. I teach anthropology here at Princeton University, and I'm the director of the Brazil Lab at the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. Our event today on Amazonian deforestation and climate change tackles some of the key issues debated at the Glasgow Climate Change Conference, which ended last weekend with a call to more effective advances and an unprecedented display of critical alliances between indigenous and environmental and racial justice movements. A major carbon sink and under increasing threat, the Amazonian rainforest is indeed at the center of multiple efforts to limit global warming, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and to facilitate carbon trading. Not to mention Amazonia's incredibly rich biocultural diversity that challenges expert ecologies of knowledges and forces us to reconsider our very ways of living. All our Brazil Lab and Princeton Amazonian initiatives would not have been possible without a sustained partnership with the amazing environmentalist and social entrepreneur, Tasso Azevedo, who coordinates the cutting-edge, multidisciplinary and multi-institutional network, MapBiomas, and Tasso is with us here today. MapBiomas is a digital platform that produces annual land cover and land use change maps in Brazil and across South America, and now also in Indonesia, and with plans to bring its mapping to the Congo Basin. A renowned public intellectual and a Skoll Fellow, Tasso has taught at Princeton and will be back here in January for another timely winter session workshop on safeguarding Amazonia. Tasso, thank you so much for all you do on so many fronts and always creatively and caringly so. We are greatly honored to welcome to Princeton the trailblazing scientist Luciana Gatti, who is a researcher at the Brazilian National Institute of Space Research, INPE, and a professor of nuclear technology at the Nuclear and Energy Research Institute at the University of São Paulo. Her climate change research is mainly concerned with the role of the Amazon rainforest in the emission and absorption of greenhouse gases and the effect of climate variables on these processes. She has published in the world's top scientific journals and will share with us some of her findings on the transformation of the Amazon from a carbon sink to a carbon house that was recently published in Nature, and it has garnered significant public attention worldwide. We are also great admirers of Professor Stephen Pacala's visionary environmental work at Princeton and beyond. He's a great friend of the Brazil Lab, helping us to model what would happen to the world without the Amazon, and always generously engaging with Brazilian colleagues in efforts to understand the Amazonian planetary nexus. Thank you, Steve. Steve is the Frederick Petrie Professor in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and a faculty of the High Meadows Environmental Institute, which he directed for many years, always with an eye towards bridging daring climate science with public outreach and savvy and socially inclusive policymaking. Steve has led the influential Net Zero American Project, commissioned by the National Academy of Science, and has recently been appointed to President Joe Biden's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. We are also grateful to Alexandre Mansour and Ana Mello, who lead the communications team of Amazonia 2030, and also to Miqueias Mugi and Rodrigo Simon for their great help in the organization of the Amazonian Futures series. This is our format today. Tasso and Luciana will speak for about 15 minutes each. Steve will then have some 10 minutes to offer comments and a few questions to get the discussion going. For the audience watching from home, the chat on our YouTube channel is open, so please feel free to ask questions as the event unfolds. Our team will be collecting your questions and will forward them to me. I will then pass them on to our speakers. Thank you all for being here. Tasso, the screen is yours.
Hope you're seeing my screen. Thank you very much for introduction, João, and I'm very happy to be here with Luciana and Pacala, which is always make like amazing provocations to what we are doing. So hope this will happen today again. So since I will have like short time, I will do this on a fast mode directly. So this is something that happens. I know like looks like that you are in somewhere in Africa or so close to some desert, but that happened actually in last September 26th in São Paulo state, not very far from where I am here. That we have this amazing sand cloud or something like this, like a storm going through this city in the countryside in São Paulo. We never saw something like this before. So why it's happening, right? And what's the relationship with what we the topic of today? So this on the left side here, we have a map of the region where this city is located, which is this, the city is this red thing here. And that is surrounded by sugarcane plantations mostly. So that's all this pink that you see on the maps here. It's sugarcane. And so it happens that when you harvest sugarcane, you have like a lot of material, organic material that stays on the soil to protect the soil. And we had this immense burn area that happens in this in the weeks before that event of 26th of September. So when you harvest, you have this, all this protection of the soil with the organic material. And then we had the burning. It basically take out all the protection of the soil. And what we have at the end was like this very dry soil that was prepared for plantation. And then we just come the storms of the beginning of the spring, and it brings all this material. It was very, very dry and hot, and it brings all this material in the air suddenly going to these cities. And this is a reflex of, the extreme drought that we are having this year, that we had this year in Brazil. So you can see here that this the region where the city is here in São Paulo state, and it's basically, it was really exceptional, the drought this year. And as you see, like this data from CEMADEM, the National Center for Natural Disasters, showing that the drop of the rainfall in Brazil, especially after the year 2000. So you see like in 4 regions in Brazil, including the Southeast region where São Paulo is located, is simply declining the amount of rain that you have. And this is strongly linked, and there is a series of studies showing this, to a kind of a decreasing of the power of what the so-called flying rivers coming from the Amazon. And I think Luciana will actually explain better some of the relationships to that. But what is important is that this is a city that is located on really on the way of the rain that comes from the Amazon to the south of Brazil. And because it's so hot and dry, and we had less power from this process in the Amazon, it didn't have the sufficient force to break the dry air to come down to this region. So we are having like an immense reduction of rain in the south and southeast of Brazil. Now, so all of those things make us to think really seriously about like what happens with the land use change in Brazil and its relationship with the climate and the day-by-day life of people. So we have this project where we try to understand all these land use transitions, and we do so by a collective effort of NGOs, universities, and startups in technology, where we work together to map the land cover, land use over the country using time series of satellite image. So we use a lot of remote sensing, processing every single of the 9.5 billion pixels of 30 by 30 meters in Brazil, using artificial intelligence, and doing all of that in a collaborative way using the Google Earth engine. So with that, we can produce like maps where we have the history of the land use by just having maps for each one of the years. Now we are this year producing maps of 25 classes, land cover, land use classes. And for each pixel, the 9.5 billion pixels, you actually can know the history of the pixel. So in this case, for example, we have a pixel here where, from 85 to 2002, it was a forest, then it turns into pasture, and then moved to agriculture. So by having the history of all the pixels, you can have the history of how the land is changing. And so this is the basis of everything else that I will talk about after that. It's just like a consequence of analyzing and thinking about all this trajectory of the pixels that we have there. So today, Brazil has about 66%, 2/3 of the country is covered by native vegetation, which is good. Like there is a lot of native vegetation in the country. This makes Brazil the second largest area of forest, for example, in the world after Russia. If you look to the Amazon, this is 82% of the biome in the Amazon is still covered on forests. Not that it's a primary forest, but it's covered on forests. And then you have, from that, most of that is forests, right? So this makes about half of the territory. The Amazon is a half of the territory, and 2/3 of the forests in Brazil are still in the Amazon. It also important to know that there is also vegetation in the Amazon that's native vegetation, natural vegetation, but it's not forest. And this makes about 4% of the area. But the Amazon is so big that this is the second largest area of non-native forest vegetation in Brazil. It's larger than Pantanal and Pampa altogether. The areas that are non-forest and natural in the Amazon. So one of the analysis that we can do when we look at all those maps year by year is to understand what exactly is the areas that didn't change and what are the areas that have some change during this period. So in the last 36 years, between 85 and 2020, 19% of the Amazon have changed the land cover land use. It can change, for example, from non-forest and back to forest, or from non-forest to agriculture to pasture, from pasture to agriculture, and so on. So this makes the Amazon and Brazil in general as probably the most dynamic place in the world right now. It's where, if you take the large countries in the world, is where things are moving very fast. So in this process of changing, we lost in the last 36 years, 43 million hectares of forest. This is equivalent to California. California is 42 million hectares. So there's a state of California that we lose on forest this period. And on the other hand, we gain 38 or 44 million hectares of agriculture and pasture, like say farming land. And this varies a lot depending on the states that you are. I'm not going to details, but just want to give you the picture that say this varies a lot depending on where you are in the Amazon. So there are places where we still have almost 95% of forest, and there are places where we have very few, like 20%, like in Tocantins, for example. In this process, on the last 3 decades, the area of cropland and pasture, like farm in general, increased threefold. And it's now accounts for, we are talking now about 63 million hectares of farming land, including pasture land and cropland. So from everything that we lose on natural environment in the Amazon, 97% is converted to pasture land and cropland. So basically, everything goes to this type of land use. On the other hand, there is a lot of area being regenerating in Brazil. That's something that was not really appreciated or understood. So for the first time, we were able this year to actually estimate how much land in Brazil is in regeneration right now. And this is about 48 million hectares. There is a lot of areas that is in regeneration. And regeneration, in this case, the criteria is 3 years, at least 3 years in regeneration, right? And 13 million of those are in the Amazon, which is the frontier. But on the other hand, because we now know what is the regeneration, we can also calculate how much we are losing on forest on top of primary forest loss. And it is staggering that now in Brazil, which is in the middle of the panel here, you have an area equivalent to the primary forest loss or primary vegetation loss. We have an area that is equivalent to that on secondary vegetation that we are losing. So we are cutting down the forests that are there, and we are cutting down also the forest that is regenerating, which is striking. We're talking about 1 million hectares last year, for example. And the same thing is starting to happen in the Amazon. So if you take into account the current numbers that we talk about deforestation in Brazil, which is basically primary forest deforestation, there is another area which is equivalent to 1/3 of the loss in primary forest, and we are losing actually on secondary vegetation. This whole thing explains why Brazil is the 5th largest greenhouse gas emitter in the planet. We are there because we have a lot of emission from the land use and land use change. 73% of our greenhouse gas emissions in 2020, it was due to land use, which is a lot of the yellow stuff here, which is agriculture, and then and land use change, which is the green in this graphic. And if you take just the land use change part, which is most of that is deforestation, 43% is due to land use change of our emissions. Now, digging a little bit into that, in 2020, 94% of all the land use change emissions that we have in Brazil is related to deforestation, making it the single largest source of emission in Brazil. And I just pinned into that because that's the first time we can see this data separate, is that 86% of this is actually primary forest deforestation, but we have 8% of our emissions now that's coming from the deforestation of the secondary forest or the regeneration. And we are not even accounting here for the degradation processes, which the new challenge that we have right now is to think about the degradation process, and which will link with what Luciana will talk in a bit. Deforestation in the Amazon accounts for 78% of the greenhouse gas emissions related to the land use change. And if this was a country, like only the emissions from deforestation in the Amazon, if it was a country, it would be the 10th largest greenhouse gas emitter in the planet, comparing to other places. Now, Brazil and COP signed 3 agreements, and one, it's our NDC, our commitment to reduce 50% the net emissions in relation to 2005 levels, but also we signed 2 volunteer agreements. One, the forest deal, which is aimed to halt and reverse loss of forest and land degradation by 2030, very important, and contribute to reduce 30% of the methane emissions by 2030. I will not even go to the methane right now. I just keep on what happens if we actually achieve those commitments, thinking on just the deforestation part. Okay, so if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions in Brazil that I showed before, the part that is not like land use change, it has been really growing until 2015, and then since 2015 is actually declining or stabilized the emissions. So it's pretty much controlled there of what's going on. So the whole thing for us is how we actually work with the land use change bit. So just get more into the details about the land use change. If we consider the net emissions, means like the emissions and also the removals, we are talking about the emissions will be like almost 1 gigaton, and then we have about 600 million tons of removals, and then and the net emissions will be 362 million tons. Now, and that's my last point here. Even let's consider that all the agriculture, energy, waste management, etc., emissions, industry emissions, keep on the same level between now and 2030, which is this gray part here. And we decrease the emissions from deforestation, which is this bit, almost 1 gigaton. We still have some small emissions that will come from other land use change, but let's say we decrease, basically cut down the deforestation. Because of the removals that are still very large, and that's very important from what Luciana will say afterwards, because we have to guarantee this, then our emissions will drop by 65% of the 2020 levels. And if you compare with 2005, it will be like 78% reduction. So this will be easily the largest contribution ever from anyone to reduce emissions globally. This will represent 2% of reduction of global emissions and will represent 10% of the reductions that is needed according to the last UNEP GAP report that was launched 3 weeks ago. So I mean, with this, I want to emphasize that we are seeing things happening in Brazil that are related to the change of the climate and change on the conditions that we live, and we're feeling the impacts of that. And we know that this is like the most important thing to tackle climate change from our part, right? So everything we have to go, we have to cut down this deforestation and meet the commitments that we made last week. And with that, I'll end up here. How about that? 15 minutes now.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Tasso and MapBiomas team, for your critically important work and very sobering presentation, Tasso, but also ending with this visionary note on what can actually be done and how crucial it is to tackle the question of deforestation if Brazil wants to meet any possible targets. So, Luciana Gatti, what a pleasure and honor to have you with us today. The screen is yours now.
Thank you very much. This is my pleasure, but also the big vision is a nightmare. No, it's horrible, and I make this nightmare a little stronger. Let me share with you. Let me put this, and here I will present our paper in Nature showing the link between deforestation and the carbon emissions and the losses in precipitation and increasing temperature. First, we have a vertical profile in these 4 regions. We start here, and then in the 6 years we made this. But what I would like to show you is the difference between the carbon flux from each of these 4 regions. Is around the carbon flux in this region is 10 times higher here. Why? All the research we've done is to try understand these big differences in the forest, what make this northeast part different from here and the southeast part. Then we started to study precipitation, temperature, how much burned, how much have the water in soil, how much the vegetation is green. And just to look at the 9 years, the correlation are not strong. We can explain very well the fire emissions, and they depend strongly from temperature and how the leaves is no more green, and the deficit in the water in soil. We can explain 90-something% for the fire emissions, but from the other part of the carbon flux, the correlations are really very weak. And then come why? The important question we done was what change happens in the foresting at each of these 4 regions. Then we make 2 kind of studies. One, we get 40 years precipitation, temperature, and another, we calculate how much is deforested each region. Okay, then the first idea started when we calculate how much is deforested each region. The strongest carbon flux coming from the region more deforested, 37%. The second strongest flux coming from the second deforested. And in the West, that is near neutral, the carbon flux, we observe deforestation lower than 20%. That is the law in Brazil is to conserve 80% and use just 20%. It could be a dream if the law could be preserved, followed, but unfortunately it's not. Okay, first, for the raw region in this red line, the temperature in these 40 years increased 1 degree for the whole year. But for this time of peak of dry season is August, September, October, increase 1.4 for the whole region, without consider more one region or another. And for precipitation, we have a stabilization in the whole year, but during dry season, we can observe these losses in precipitation. Let's see each of these 4 regions first. This region most deforested, we observe clearly here 37% deforested. I would like to highlight what is happening during dry season. August, September, October lose 34% of precipitation. This is rainforest. You know, how can have a so big a reduction in precipitation and still have healthy and with the functions, you know, working very well. When we look at the second most deforested region, ALF, 28, the forest lose 24% precipitation. I will make one more comment. Here is higher than 30%, almost 40%, until December 2018. This is very important to understand. This nightmare time with stratospheric deforestations is not included here. And let's think in this, because until December 2018, the scenario was terrible. Imagine it today. And then when we look, when we look at the west part, that less deforested, we see that the losses in precipitation is 20%. Then come the first question, why here that you have a less deforestation lose 20%? The first hypothesis is because the deforestation is concentrated here, the water comes less to this part. The evapotranspiration from the trees represent in the mean around 1/3 of the recycle of water. If we deforested here around 30%, then this is the reflect we have with less precipitation, but also remember the slide Tasso show, this impact whole Brazil, you know, and the worst part in Brazil is also August, September, October. And it's important to understand that precipitation is connected strongly with temperature, because when the plants get the water in liquid phase in soil and put into the atmosphere like a water vapor, for the water come to liquid to gas, we need to give energy, and in the heat kind of energy. Then in this process, the atmosphere is cooled. If we have a 20% less trees in the Amazon, we can understand the impact in form precipitation and increasing temperature. Now let's see what's happening temperature. I just comment August, September, October, that is the worst. Here, the increase in the last 4 years was 1.9, and here 28% of the forest, the increase was 2.5. This come a question that I make to myself many times. If here is the worst, 37% of the forest, why the increase in temperature was not the highest? Here come another hypothesis from me. We have water surface very high in this part. For example, Amazon River can have 200 kilometers large in some areas. Rio Tapajós here have 20 kilometers large, you know. And then the evaporation, I believe, is compensating the reduction in evapotranspiration, make the temperature increase not so strong than here, that you have less rivers, less water bodies. Then the evapotranspiration represents a very important process for the recycle of rain. And if we look here per month, if we just look August and September, the increase in temperature in this region is 3.1 degrees. This is unbelievable to imagine in the Amazon forest, a tropical region, this kind of increase in temperature. And these effects are promoting every year a stress in the vegetation. And then what is happening? Because people know that drought years make the Amazon be a source. But what we found out is that in this part that is very deforested, every year have a big stress during dry season. Dry season is each year more hotter, drier, and longer. And here we observe also increasing temperature, but the amount that is still rain here, you know, when we look at the amount here, is still a very high amount. Don't make stress to the forest. But in this side, look at this. Actually, during 3-4 months, the total amount of precipitation is something between 40-50 milliliters. This is a tropical forest. How trees can survive in so big stress condition. And then we understand what is happening in this first, let's show. Here, we understand completely this kind of flux be so higher than here, and here be 10 times higher than here. Let's return to here. And here is NB is net biome exchange flux in the southeast part. We get the total flux, remove biomass burning emissions. NB is all other parts, that is photosynthesis, respiration, and the decomposition. This is the main process happening. And the scaring we observed that during these 9 years, each time the forest represents a strongest emission. And we observe clearly these last 3 years, the surface increasing extremely the emissions. And the correlations are first with temperature, and the second with the amount of water in soil available to the trees. When we look at this, remember I told how much, if we just look August and September, in blue is the mean of the first 10 years in this 40 years time series. This is the first decade, and this is the last decade. Observe the change in the temperature during these 4 decades, you know, with the so big change. And then we can understand the forests are changing, you know, with this stress, and is stopping to be the sink, mortality is increasing, and the forest is becoming more flammable. Each year more flammable, you know, and this is the scary map of cattle production in Brazil. The beef come 36% from Amazon. Word, please. Don't buy beef from Amazon. You can help us. Don't buy wood from Amazon. You can help us. And also soybean, please, because people are deforesting to make money. If the commerce help us, it will be a very successful way to control and decrease deforestation in Amazon. Okay, I just would like to highlight this. This is EVI. EVI, how much the forest is green. This is the most preserved place in Amazon northwest part, and this is the most degraded part of the Amazon southeast part. Observe here, included during dry season, it's almost the forest don't feel dry season, everything continue the same, the functions, is no stress. But when we look at the southeast part, we observe the big stress for forest. Imagine one imagination tree with the leaves very green. When the precipitation coming down and the temperature come up, the leaves will be lower green until brown, and then the leaves will fall more quickly, will represent decomposition, and also in this region is the strongest mortality having Amazon. Then the forest itself represents more emission in this place. And this is a resume, everything we observed. I would like to highlight 2 points. This east part is the reason for Amazon be a source now, because the emissions from biomass burning is really very high, and the driver is the deforestation. And look, this is the deforestation. This is losses in precipitation during August, September, October, and this is increasing temperature August, September, October. We observe in this northeast part, the forests are compensating only 20% of the biomass burn emission. But in the southeast, forest itself represents 1/3 of the emissions. Is the unique part of the Amazon that is no more carbon sink from forest when we observe the annual balance. And here is around neutral. This can mean the forest is compensating around all emissions. When we look east versus west, east is in this region 1 is 27% deforested. In the region 2, 11% deforested. When we compare the carbon flux, here to here is 10 times higher. This is a very important result. This say to us, the carbon emissions is not only deforestation. Our inventory consider only deforestation, and then we observe the emissions are not completely considered. And we have also emissions from the biomass burning in the forest that was not deforested, will burn together because they put fire August, September, October, when everything is very, very dry. And also along the years, the composition will represent strong emission. Another study showed that the recomposition of this, the recovery from this area represent compensate just 1/3 of the total emission. And also we have the forest itself presenting more decomposition. This can mean in this region, the forest is dying more than regrowing. This is a horrible, because when we make this kind of study bottom up, we think that all preserved forests is still producing a carbon sink. And our studies show not if the region is very deforested, because the impact will be, let's say, deforestation represents direct emissions, but also indirect emissions, because it changes the climate condition that will impact the carbon sink ability for the forest. And then now I would like to say one thing more. Until our study, Amazon was deforested 17%. Let's think in Brazilian Amazon. We get 50 years to deforest 70%, but just in the last 3 years, Amazon was almost 5% deforested. How is Amazon now? This is really scaring me, making me crazy, because I cry, know how was before this crazy time in Brazil with deforestation. Some region cross the tipping point now. This is an important question we don't know. The Northeast part is still with something we don't know. You know, I could show more comparison that another study showed the same, you know, for this part. And this is a map from Adriana Esquivel with mortality showing that here, the mortality is 3-4 times higher than the other parts of the Amazon. I'm so sorry, give it so this bad news, and but this is not a reality, because we deforest Amazon 5% more than after this study. You know, this is a nightmare.
So we share your outrage, Luciana, and we are so grateful for the science that you're doing, that we hope very fast, you know, we'll be able to inform, you know, both public mobilization towards this, but also, you know, sane and important, healthy, you know, policy making. So, Stephen, your comments and questions.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Tasso and Luciana, for two extremely interesting and compelling talks. And disturbing talks, right? So Tasso showed that how much ongoing deforestation there is, not just of primary forest, but also of regenerating secondary forest, and how much could be gained from a greenhouse gas perspective in halting deforestation. Luciana summarized her own excellent work and the work of others that reaffirms many of the mechanisms and phenomena that we've all worried about when it comes to an Amazonian tipping point. As an ecologist, this is one of the things that keeps me up at night. Very few ecosystems in the world seem to have these positive feedbacks that are evidently in place in the Amazon. You deforest, it makes local climate change. It also shifts to a type of vegetation to grasses that are more flammable. So the climate change and the competitive shift together make it more flammable, which cause additional forest loss. And then there's this positive feedback. And at some point, it's not recoverable, right? The only bright spot in the whole literature I can think of on this work is that most modern Earth system climate models didn't predict the Amazonian collapse, but they lacked the critical mechanisms historically, and almost all still do. They don't have the sophisticated fire. They don't have the sophisticated interactions between the grasses and the trees, and so on. But one thing they do have that some of the other literatures don't is the impact of CO2 fertilization, which helps the trees to grow back. But there's a woman named Isa Kano who led an effort here that compiled the most modern GCMs that are able to include sophisticated fire and able to include the competitive mechanisms and able to include the biophysical feedbacks. And all of those models now predict Amazonian collapse from business as usual emissions and climate change associated with it and deforestation, beginning in now and really accelerating around 2040. So I think the news now on the scientific front is uniformly bleak unless we take really significant action. And I think it's particularly poignant for Brazil because this is only, a tipping of the Amazon. It's one of the only things I can think of that would prevent Brazil from emerging as one of the world's strongest economies, right? And so, this is a dangerous thing for Brazilians and for the world. Now, on the positive side, Tasso mentioned COP26, and there were a couple of agreements at COP26 that I thought we might want to talk about a little bit. The most relevant here is the 100 nations that agreed to halt deforestation by 2030. One can be a cynic and point out that there was also an agreement in 2014 that did exactly nothing, but Brazil wasn't a signatory to that, and it is now. And also that agreement didn't include financing. And this one does include financing. There are pledges from a dozen countries for $12 billion in financing, and pledges from private companies for an additional $7 billion, and then pledges for us in a separate agreement for $2 billion to help with indigenous peoples weather some of the changes that are coming. So I'd like to ask both of you, and I'll start with Tasso. What do you think about this agreement? And please comment both on the agreement itself and on the financing. Is this likely to work, or are you encouraged or not so encouraged? Tasso, you want to start? Unmute yourself, please.
Yeah. So let's say I think Brazil signed this more for a pressure for the situation that we were on the beginning of COP, because on the week before, we were actually shamed by a report from the United Nations Environmental Program, showing that from the 20 largest economies, we were the only one that actually went backwards in our commitments to reduce emissions. So there's an argument there for that. And I think this was signed with a vision that, this is 2030, we will not have to solve that. Because everything that is going on in Brazil right now, it doesn't have it's simply going in the opposite direction of what is written on the commitment, which is halt completely the deforestation. It's not even talking about illegal or legal deforestation, just saying halt deforestation and land degradation, right? So so now the other question is it possible to do it? And I'm totally positive on it. I think it's totally doable. Like we show in Brazil that between 2004 and 2012, deforestation went down by 80%. It actually went to levels of 4,000 square kilometers. And we are now going above 10,000 square kilometers. So I think it's totally doable, but it's impossible to do it. There's no firm, decision from, the governance standpoint of view that you really want to do it. So I think it's good that Brazil signed, because now it's like it can change. Like you can't just change the government and say, oh, we're not committed anymore, because it will be like a worse disaster. But I think that it's something that we have to wait for, next administration, so we can see things moving into this direction. Now, thinking about the money, I think we also have an experience on that, right? We got, through the Amazon Fund, we got almost $2 billion in payments for the reduction of deforestation that we had on that period between 2004 and 2012. So we know that this could really happen. Now the news are that it's not just like the 2 billion on the table. It's actually, there is much more money on the table if you can present results. 20. But you have to present results. There will not be funding if you don't present the results. And the fact in Brazil right now, it basically screw up with the Amazon Fund. So half of those funds that we get from the results in the past, we are not able to use because we just changed the governance and so on. So so I think that it's very positive that we sign it, not because of the things that will happen now, but because of the things that can happen in the future.
Thank you. Luciana, do you want to add to that? And you can discuss worldwide, not just Brazil.
What the problem is just intention. What happens with the country that signed and don't do anything or do the opposite? Brazil in the last year increasing more than 90% the emissions. Brazil are increasing emissions in everywhere, in deforestation, in the energy, in the agricultural part, and then let's see. Is this, but this is different. Okay, I know Brazil very well. I'm here, but many countries is happening the same. I think this kind of agreements need to be different. Some commercial rules where if the country don't reduce every year some amount, because just to say, in 2030, Amazon gone. We can't increase the deforestation now to say, the illegal deforestation there will be reduced, and during this time we make the illegal become illegal, everything is fine. We need to stop this because we are going faster to the collapse. In Brazil, we observe clearly, we have 3 years records in deforestation and the records in reduced precipitation. And now we have a storm from desert in Brazil. How can be imaginable? It's like there is abyss. Let's go faster because I'm very anxious. I want to arrive in the abyss faster. We needed to stop voluntary issues, we needed to have more commitments, and in this way will not work it. Will not work it. People put money first, then life. Unfortunately, this 1% that are the owner of Earth, they don't care about life. We needed to change this, the way we done. I'm skeptical.
Thank you.
Stephen, if I could just jump in, Stephen, before you ask the question, just I would be curious, and I'm sure the audience too, how you react to those statements from the perspective of the United States, of a new administration in the United States, which is being more vocal. It's in terms of the climate Paris Agreement, Biden was there and made commitments as well. The infrastructure bill released here. How do you see this question of accountability actually flows and the role of the market here, if it can have any in a more progressive way?
Yeah, so if you want to take a positive view on the climate problem globally, there is a lot to talk about. Wind and solar, now the cheapest forms of electricity on the margin, and lithium-ion batteries are poised to make internal combustion engines in the light and medium duty vehicle segments extinct. I think those things were going to happen anyway economically, but the policies that are before the US Congress right now will make them happen faster. Biden's plan to get to 80% clean electricity by 2080 and to get to half the vehicle fleet on the way to all of it gone by 2035 are realistic. And there's enough money in those bills to actually speed the transition that, as I said, would have happened anyway, but make it happen fast enough. Also, there is money and probably enough in the United States to increase marginally the size of our anthropogenic carbon sink from 700 megatons to 850. And so I think we're in a strong position that way, but certainly not from prudent action in the past, except for the investment in research that led to the decrease in the prices of alternatives. Brazil faces a different kind of pressures because, it's a country that is simultaneously a powerhouse and a developing economy, and has this remarkably fragile and extremely important ecosystem that is imperiled by positive feedback and climate change. So the situation looks better domestically inside the United States, and certainly with an administration that is determined to do something about it. That said, I think that if you had that in Brazil, given the experience in the past that, money does halt deforestation, right, or reduce it, you could make real progress. And with that in mind, I'd like to ask Tasso one last question, and then I think we really should turn it over to the audience. Tasso, I understand that there are new official deforestation numbers that have just come out, and could you comment on those? Or would you comment?
Yeah, actually just come out as we are speaking here. There is like all this buzz happening in the world because the data was out, and it's like it's really staggering because we're talking about 13.2 thousand square kilometers of deforestation this year. Is the highest number since 2006. So it's growing. It's It's a 22% growth over last year. And if you compare to the, since the beginning of this administration, of Bolsonaro's administration, we're talking about a 75% increase on deforestation, which is really, really, the biggest increase in a very short period of time. Also, we saw for the first time since 1998, an increase on deforestation on every single state in the Amazon. So it's not like anyone escaped. It's like every one of them going up, which is extremely. And I think that what sum up to be really the best, the worst situation is that the government basically hide the numbers before COP. So during COP, they didn't talk about that, but the numbers were with them 2 weeks before starting COP. So it's really like lack of transparency and everything. So this has a consequence for Brazil because it makes Brazil to look like someone that is not trustable. And so this will have consequence now in commerce, for example. So both in US and in Europe, and also now we know that will happen also in China. They are building blocks and barriers for products that come from deforestation. So in Europe, like they just announced yesterday that the new policy basically will request companies to demonstrate that their products are not coming from deforestation. Look, this is different from saying that if there is deforestation, somebody find out, then you have a problem. No, what they're saying is like everyone has to demonstrate that the products are not coming from deforestation. The same thing is happening, like that's the process happening in US Congress. So, I mean, like you have 1% of the properties in Brazil with deforestation last year, but 99% of the producers that didn't have deforestation, they will have to ask to answer this question also. And that's a question of trust in the country. So yeah, very bad shape and very bad news about those numbers. So yeah.
Okay, so let me just jump in. We have a lively conversation on the channel. Many people sending questions. So I will create two bundles initially. Okay, so the first bundle from our good friend and colleague Saulo Kozlowski to Luciana. Could you give us a sense of how do you estimate this carbon flux in a specific spot over time? So it's almost like a methodological question. How did you measure this over time? Then we have a question from Marion Adenay. Thank you for these excellent presentations. By the way, everybody is praising the presentations. Tasso mentioned regeneration. What is your sense of how forest reforestation could contribute to mitigating the carbon flux changes that Luciana spoke about? And then we have a question from Rob Davenport for Tasso also. What alternative land uses could involve rural and forest populations, both rather than cattle ranching? The positive is that the land use regenerative potential is so enormous. And I think the other question related to that, also for Luciana, Tasso, and maybe Stephen can also pitch in, is the question, what is the impact of this, that the picture, the bleak scenario for the agribusiness sector? How are they reacting to this, and which role could they play in any campaign towards tackling down this issue? So these are big questions, a first round, and then we go next. So Luciana, do you want to get started? And then Tasso?
Yeah, okay. I will share my screen again. I think it'll be easier, just to show. This is the vertical profile we measure. Each color is the vertical annual mean profile, but you can think, this is the concentration we sample in each place. It's starting 4.4 kilometer high until 0.3 more or less. And then we subtract the concentration the air mass have when you arrive in Brazil. And then we subtract. You can see here, when the concentration going to surface increase is because surface is emission, and when decrease is because surface is absorption. And we can see here the picture also that we can compare with flux. Look at this, it's 2016, 17, 18. We, to calculate the flux, we use this concentration here. We subtract the concentration. We consider the time the air mass arrived there, and then we integrated this. But I can send you the paper for anyone. Please send me a message, and I can give you details and share the methods. Okay.
That's great. Yes, Tasso, do you want to kick in on some of those questions? Mike is mute.
Let's talk a little bit about first the regeneration. So I was just looking here, like from the 600 million tons of CO2 that we have as removals every year, or at least in 2020, 630 million, 38% is actually from secondary vegetation, which most of that is regeneration, right? Because most of what we have in growing as secondary forests in Brazil is regeneration more than plantation. Plantation is it's very limited. And then 61% comes from the preserved areas, like protected areas. So that's let's say 1/3. It's coming from regeneration, but that's the one that grows faster. So the other thing that we find out is when you decrease deforestation, immediately starts to increase regeneration. And I think because the logic of that is that when you decrease deforestation, it's actually decreasing deforestation both sides, both primary forests and secondary forests. So one would think, right, that okay, you stop deforestation in primary forests, and then people will just work on the land that is already open and just use better. So you go to the secondary forest, but that's not what we are seeing. When you decrease deforestation, it has an effect on both sides. So our guess, this is just a guess right now, is that if we actually put down deforestation quickly, the regeneration will flourish. And so there is a double effect. So there is one effect which is less emission. Also, there is another effect which is regrowth of forests. We have seen that on the other biomes, like the Atlantic rainforest, like the Cerrados and Pampa, which is like, let's say, optimistic, right? Is a good thing. And that has a relationship also with the alternative use of the land. So I'll just use one story of something that is happening in São Paulo state that might give us some ideas of things that could happen also in the borders of the Amazon. So in São Paulo state, the area of pasture in São Paulo state decreased by almost half since 85 to now. So it basically, cut down half of the pasture. And this is occupied basically by cropland, most of that sugarcane, but there is also soybean and others, right? So, and you don't see really cropland growing over forests or natural vegetation. It's basically growing over pasture. But what is interesting is that if you look at the production of meat in São Paulo state, it's pretty much stable. Actually, there are some years that was still growing. So what is happening is like an extreme quick process of intensification of the use of pastureland. And one of the things that we did this year was to evaluate the quality, or let's say the level of degradation of pastureland in Brazil. And we find out that in São Paulo, for example, it's really growing very fast. Actually, it's decreasing very fast the amount of pasture that are in degraded lands. And that's very logical, because if you want to have a more efficient use of the land for pasture, for example, you have to regenerate the soil. You can't produce more on degraded land. So this has an interesting effect. So I'm thinking on the Amazon like that, we have 63 million hectares open right now, and agriculture is a very minor part of that. if we can, at the same time that we are decreasing deforestation, we can push this other area to actually be more on intensive use. I'm not talking about like moving everything to soybean or something like that, but it's like intensification using cocoa, agroforestry systems that we are seeing growing everywhere. That would be like probably the solution, apart from managing sustainably the forest for the forest products.
And Luciana, maybe that question of how you feel, there has been an incredible media attention to your study and scholars are talking, but I wonder if, how has the agribusiness reacted to this bleak picture that you gave, which impacts, their productivity and their revenue? Have you heard anything, or how do you think the agribusiness could think differently about business as usual?
I didn't receive anything, but my director, yes, and but I think I have a part of the agribusiness that still think like 40 years ago, and doing the same way, the productions. But we are in the same side. When we say that the forest in Amazon, we have less precipitation in Brazil, we are also saying agribusiness, you need rain, and then preserve Amazon need to be also interesting for the agribusiness, because in a short time will be a very big crisis in the agribusiness in Brazil, and the economy in Brazil is very focused in agribusiness. Then the climate condition is the base, and we are killing the big advantage that Brazil have in these climate conditions with rain, light temperatures. The vision we need to say is that the Amazon is our protection for climate change, because absorb carbon, produce rain, and decrease temperature is important to us in the first place. These people think that this is important for the world. First is important to us because we are directly affected. Like Tasso showed, a big sandstorm in Brazil. This is unbelievable. We need to change the way we have these practices in agricultural, We need to change the way we live the earth. This is not sustainable.
Not sustainable.
So I'd like to just jump in that one thing that there's quite a bit of support for the climate mitigation measures that involve the land in the U.S. agricultural community now, because they see or smell the possibility of another way to get paid. All right. So one way to get paid is to increase the amount of carbon, to rebuild the carbon backbone of cropland soils that increases their fertility, water holding capacity, resilience to climate change, nitrogen use efficiency, all kinds of co-benefits, and removes carbon from the atmosphere, transfers it back into the soil. And there's quite a large capacity here. Brazil is particularly interesting because its soils, the pH amendments could be improved by crushing and spreading minerals that spontaneously take up their own mass of CO2 within a month or two. There are a lot of startup activity in the United States on this, and Brazilian soils are actually perfect for it. And so there's the possibility that Brazilian entrepreneurs in the agribusiness sector could find a new way to get paid by mitigating the climate problem. Another target should be Brazil's gigantic number of cattle with the methane agreement that came out of COP26. So I hope that the economic incentives and that the business incentives in that sector could be brought around the way they're starting to be brought around in some other places.
So Stephen, along those lines, one listener actually ask you, how would you think about the role the U.S. could have, meaning government, but also the market, in in keeping the Amazonian rainforest standing and doing its work? You know, what do you think could be done? Let's say if you got Joe Biden's ear on the relevance or the importance of the Amazon as a planetary nexus, what would be your 1, 2, 3 points?
Well, the first point is to make sure that the U.S. contributes the money that it's pledged to the funds that are aimed at reducing deforestation. We've got a total, including the private sector, of about $20 billion. It's a pretty big number. It's a number that's big enough to move the needle a bit in the Amazon, and we'll see if it can be made to work. The diplomatic clout of the United States in the region could actually be brought to bear here as well, but there are many more who know more about that than I do. One of the other things, other than direct aid of that sort, that the U.S. can do is that by being an early adopter of some of these technologies, they can help buy the cost down and cause some of the costs to be driven negative, right? So if it would be possible to rebuild the carbon backbone of agricultural soils in a way that actually had negative cost because of the positive impacts on your agricultural productivity, that would be a great thing. It could mean that a country like Brazil, that there wouldn't be any economic headwinds against it. And so I do think that the United States also has a responsibility to reduce the costs of all these technologies by being an early adopter. It's been distressing to me that we have been in the opposite, right, in recent history. And I'm really encouraged that we're about finally to get out ahead of this.
Okay, now
can I make a comment?
Yes, sure. Absolutely. Go, Luciana. Yeah.
If I could talk with your president, I will ask, please stop buy wood from Brazil because they are coming directly from deforestation. Second, this done, the contracts in mining in Amazon, and look at where come the beef, this kind of stuff, commercial is a so strong driver. By now in Amazon, I go to Belém, to Santarém, I listen, they are constructing 10 ports there, 15 ports there to sport. This is the driver. If the international commerce stop, help, driver the deforestation, this could be much easier. This is a very important tool we need to use. Thank you, Biden.
You're preaching to the choir here. Okay, so
I would say
I may have So this is something that I'm well aware of and vocal about.
I'll just make one small comment on this. I think obviously the responsibility of the market is very important, but I will not call for a boycott, because what happens usually with boycotts is that they put on the same place the people that are doing good and doing bad. So every single general boycott that was done in history actually backfired on the people that are doing the good things. So I think that the direction is correct, but I would not say like stop to buy timber from the Amazon. I would say stop to buy timber that can trace back to demonstrate that it's coming from sustainable source, because there is people producing on a sustainable way. And by the way, these are the areas that are being sustained as forests if they are well managed. So yeah, well, I got the point, but
it's true. Yes, thank you, Tasso. Thank you. Yeah.
That's interesting. That leads me to the next question that actually came from Vinicius Duarte, which puts the focus now on the Brazilian public, on the Brazilian civil society. What can Brazilian civil society do? Which strategy? We have elections next year. Could we put into place to pressure policymakers to commit to firmer deadlines to curb deforestation? And then the other question that I myself had, which goes in the same direction, is what can the Brazilian consumers do? We know that Brazilians also consume a lot of the products that come out of deforestation, right? So we're talking about international stakeholders and consumers, but what about Brazilian consumers? What could they do, and which kind of activities, mobilizations could be done on that front, both on the Brazilian consumer side and then also on the mobilization of civil society for alternative policymaking?
I think what we have to do in the consumer side in Brazil is exactly the same as you have to do from outside. We need to know where those things come from, and if you can't have this answer, simply don't do it. Go to something else, and especially for beef, this is very important. That's extremely important that for beef in terms of the Amazon, because that's where most of the deforestation coming. Like the deforestation for soybean in the Amazon, it's very low since we had the agreement of 2008. But it's a problem in Cerrados and other places, but not in the Amazon. But for beef, it is definitely a key thing. So, and I think we should keep an immense pressure over the government and say that we really care, and we want to see the government, we want to see our representatives, and etc. pressuring for action. And if there is another thing that I would suggest is think about goat as the fur of the 20 years ago, like pele, né? Casacos de pele. I don't know the word in I think it's fur, right, in English, right? Which means goat in Brazil is coming from a tragedy on indigenous lands. So don't use it. You don't need to use it. Just simply ignore. Make it the worst thing that you can have, and ask people to avoid, because that's damaging indigenous lands. And it's impossible to control on the way the regulation works today. Impossible. There's no way to control. So, just avoid it.
Luciana?
I think exactly in this way. 2 years ago, when I look at this cattle map in Brazil, I stop eat beef. I just stop, and all my presentations, I say this: can you contribute to reduce, please reduce. It's not sustainable. The amount of Brazilian eat beef is not sustainable. It's too much. Not now, because now that the food become a commodity, Brazilians are eat bones, of cattle. This is really terrible. But I think we needed to think in sustainability, and I feel the population in Brazil is not very involved. We need to be more. To be more participant. You need to understand our power. Every citizen, need to like politics, need to change the world, you need to make always what you can do to make better this world, But we are changing.
Okay, so Luciana, this is wonderful. That's it's a wonderful place to stop this incredible conversation. We are so grateful to you and Tasso and Steve, and we want to continue this conversation, hopefully here at Princeton as well. And we want to thank you all for watching. We hope you will be here with us for future Brazil Lab events. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And on December 1st at 4:30 Eastern Time, we'll be hosting the final session of Amazonian Futures, Futuros Amazônicos. Beto Veríssimo and Clarissa Gandur will be in conversation with Princeton's Robert Sokolov on safeguarding Amazonia, the key role of public policies, exactly where we ended today. So we cannot thank you enough, Steve, Tasso, and Luciana. We wish you well, stay well, and we will see you all soon. Take good care.
You too. Thank you.